Good evening. Let's start with the lie that distorts almost every lazy conversation about war. It is the lie that the strongest military automatically wins. That if a country has the biggest budget, the most advanced weapons, the most powerful navy, the most sophisticated surveillance, and the broadest global reach, then victory is basically guaranteed. It sounds logical. It sounds obvious. And on paper, it sounds almost impossible to challenge. The United States has the most powerful conventional military machine in modern history. That is not propaganda. That is reality. Its air power is overwhelming. Its navy is dominant. Its intelligence network is vast. Its ability to project force across the planet is extraordinary. In a clean, direct, conventional confrontation, the United States can destroy almost any military on Earth. Very few serious analysts would dispute that. But here is the part that too many people still refuse to understand. Destroying military assets is not the same thing as winning a war. And that is exactly why the American debate over Iran is so dangerously shallow, because Iran is not trying to win the kind of war America wants to fight. Iran is not foolish enough to stand in the open and exchange blows with a superpower on conventional terms. It is not trying to match Washington carrier for carrier, jet for jet, or bomb for bomb. It knows that would be a catastrophe. So instead, it has built an entirely different strategy, one based not on domination, but on endurance, not on dramatic battlefield triumph, but on patient strategic erosion. The goal is brutally simple. Make America spend more, risk more, absorb more, and tolerate more than its own political system can sustain. That is the first thing this presentation has to make clear. This is not just a conflict between two states. It is a conflict between two different definitions of victory. For Washington, victory usually means visible control. It means striking targets, degrading capabilities, projecting dominance, and forcing outcomes on a timetable that can be sold to the public. But for Iran, victory can mean something far less dramatic and far more difficult to defeat. It can mean simply remaining standing, remaining operational, remaining influential, remaining too costly to break. In this kind of contest, survival is not a fallback position. Survival is the strategy. Survival is the win. That sounds counterintuitive only if you still imagine war as a contest of raw strength alone. It is not. War is also a contest of patience, structure, legitimacy, and time. Think of the analogy in the source material. A heavyweight boxer versus a smaller opponent. In a boxing ring, under boxing rules, the result is obvious. The stronger fighter dominates. But take that same fight out of the ring and into a cramped, unfamiliar, chaotic environment, a dark alley, a crowded market, a building the smaller fighter knows intimately. And now the stronger fighter's advantages begin to erode. Strength is still strength, yes, but it becomes harder to use cleanly, harder to convert into control, harder to translate into final victory. That is asymmetrical warfare in plain English. It is the art of making the stronger side fight a war that punishes strength itself. And this is not just theory. The file points to Millennium Challenge 2002, one of the largest U.S. military war games ever conducted. In that simulation, the opposing force used unconventional methods, speed, swarm tactics, surprise, irregular communications, non-traditional attack patterns, and inflicted devastating simulated losses on American forces in the early phase. Then the exercise was effectively reset and constrained. Once the red team was pushed back into a more conventional, predictable pattern, the United States won easily. That lesson should have burned itself into the strategic mind of Washington. America is devastating when the war follows American logic, but the moment the other side rejects that logic, the equation changes fast. That is the real warning here. Iran does not have to overpower the United States. It only has to trap the United States inside an expensive, prolonged, politically corrosive confrontation. And that is where the American establishment repeatedly makes its most arrogant mistake. It confuses military superiority with strategic control. It sees capability and assumes compliance. It sees force and assumes results. But history keeps delivering the same humiliating lesson. A superpower can be brilliant at destroying things and still fail to impose a stable political outcome. Vietnam proved that. Afghanistan proved that. Iraq should have buried that illusion forever. Yet the illusion survives because power is seductive, and power often makes policymakers intellectually lazy. Iran's leadership, whatever else one thinks of it, is not operating from that kind of laziness. The source describes what we might call a strategic matrix, a layered system in which every move serves multiple purposes at once. That is what weaker powers have to do. They cannot waste resources. They cannot afford symbolic gestures that achieve only one thing, Every alliance, every weapons program, every diplomatic relationship, every regional connection, every information campaign has to do several jobs at the same time. It must deter, complicate, delay, and reshape the environment before a major conflict even begins. Let's break that down. First, internal cohesion. One of the oldest fantasies in imperial strategy is the idea that outside pressure will cause a targeted population to turn against its own government and collapse from within. Sometimes that happens, but sometimes the reverse happens. Sometimes outside pressure hardens national identity, sharpens survival instincts, and makes the regime more difficult to fracture. If bombs fall, if military pressure intensifies, if the conflict is framed as a national struggle against foreign aggression, then external force can unify what it was supposed to divide. In other words, pressure can produce resistance instead of surrender. And if that happens, then the first political objective of escalation has already failed. Second, regional entanglement. Regional. Iran does not need to stand alone and wait to be hit. It has spent decades building relationships and networks that complicate any U.S. calculation. The purpose is not mystery. The purpose is deterrence through complexity. If a strike on Iran threatens to ignite multiple flashpoints across the region, then Washington is no longer planning one operation. It is managing cascading instability. It is gambling that a controlled confrontation will stay controlled. History suggests that such confidence is often reckless. The wider the network, the greater the risk that tactical escalation becomes regional disorder. Third, global opinion. This is the battlefield that arrogant powers consistently underestimate until it starts costing them real support. Wars are not won only by missiles and ships. They are also fought in headlines, in diplomatic chambers, in allied capitals, in financial markets, in public demonstrations, and in the moral language used to justify violence. If Iran can frame itself as the smaller power resisting outside coercion, then every American move becomes harder to defend, harder to sustain, and harder to internationalize. Allies hesitate, domestic consensus frays, legitimacy thins out, and once legitimacy starts to drain away, military success begins generating political debt. Fourth, strategic attrition. This is where the argument becomes sharpest. Iran does not need one cinematic triumph. It does not need to win one glorious battle that rewrites the map overnight. It only needs to slowly alter the cost-benefit calculation in Washington. It needs to make confrontation feel permanent, expensive, risky, and increasingly pointless. It needs to turn the central question from, can America win, into how long is America willing to keep paying for this? That is how stronger powers get exhausted. Not in one dramatic collapse, but in the slow bleed of money, attention, credibility, and patience. And that leads to the most underrated weapon in the entire analysis. Time is not neutral here. Time favors the side that can absorb pain longer and think farther ahead. The American political system is structurally impatient. Elections arrive quickly, media cycles move faster, Congress argues over budgets constantly, public support is volatile, every administration wants results it can package, display, and defend. Iran's strategic culture, as described in the source, operates on an entirely different clock. It thinks in decades. It prepares long before the shooting starts. It builds the environment slowly, alliance by alliance, missile by missile, narrative by narrative, more so that when a crisis finally becomes visible, much of the real shaping has already been done. That is why looking only at the conventional balance of forces misses the point. The battlefield is not born when the missiles launch. The battlefield is built years earlier. Then there is the economic trap. And this part is ruthless. American platforms are immensely capable and immensely expensive. Carriers cost billions. The aircraft they carry cost staggering sums. The layered systems required to defend them cost even more. Iran, by contrast, has invested in relatively cheap tools that do not need perfect effectiveness to create strategic pressure. Drones, missiles, swarms, disruption threats. These systems do not have to dominate the battlefield to be useful. They only have to force the United States into a high-cost defensive posture. And when it costs the stronger side far more to defend than it costs the weaker side to threaten, the mathematics of war start to turn ugly. The superpower begins bleeding resources in ways that are militarily manageable but politically corrosive. So what is the real conclusion? Not that America is weak, that would be foolish. Not that Iran is unbeatable, that would also be foolish. The real conclusion is harder, more serious, and far more uncomfortable. A superpower can dominate the battlefield and still fail strategically if it misunderstands the kind of war it is in. That is the heart of this file. The most dangerous mistake is not underestimating an enemy's weapons. It is underestimating an enemy's definition of success. If Washington keeps measuring victory through targets hit, platforms deployed, and displays of force, while Tehran measures victory through endurance, survival, cost imposition, and political exhaustion, then America may keep winning the visible phases of the conflict while steadily losing the larger strategic contest underneath them. And that is the final point. The central question was never whether Iran could defeat America in a clean, conventional war. Of course it cannot. That was never the real issue. The real question is whether Iran can survive American pressure long enough to make Washington conclude that endless confrontation is too expensive, too messy, too distracting, and too unsustainable. According to the logic of the source, that is exactly the game Iran has been playing all along. And that is what makes this argument so unsettling, because if survival is victory and endurance is winning, then the most powerful military on earth can still find itself trapped in a war it knows how to fight, but does not know how to finish. Thank you.